30 miles away offshore, on the island of Nantucket, a haven for readers and writers, the Nantucket Book Festival presents its answer to social distancing. I'm Jane Alexander, Nantucket Book Festival alumna, welcoming you to At Home with Authors.
On this episode of At Home with Authors.
It was the summer of 2007 and the security situation was getting much worse.
Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David Rohde joins us to talk about his time reporting from Afghanistan, including his kidnapping by the Taliban and how he escaped.
Rohde's escape was a dramatic break in a case that had been kept quiet for 7 months by the New York Times, which asked other media outlets, including ABC News, to also keep it quiet.
He'll share with us how, as a 28-year-old reporter in Bosnia, he discovered the evidence on the ground of the massacre in Srebrenica, which led to his arrest and imprisonment by the Bosnian Serbs.
I am very happy to be in Belgrade and very grateful to the assistance of the Serbian government in getting me here.
And we'll discuss his new book, In Deep, the FBI, the CIA, and the Truth About America's Deep State. David Rohde, now executive editor of the New Yorker magazine's website, joins us from Maine. Before we get into your current book, which is called In Deep, the FBI, the CIA, and the Truth About America's Deep State, I really want to take people back farther than your episode in Afghanistan to the work that you did that earned you a Pulitzer Prize, to Srebrenica. And I'm going to be interviewing Samantha Power in a couple of weeks. And she mentions you quite a bit in the early part of her memoir. You were both reporting from Bosnia at the same time. Take us back to that defining moment when we heard something was going on in Srebrenica. There were satellite photos that the U.S. had, but we didn't get closer than the satellite photos until you came along.
The town had fallen, the town of Srebrenica. I was actually off in Australia. It was July 11th, 1995. And Samantha, we were young reporters and, we're still very close friends. She was in Sarajevo and wrote front page stories for several days for the Washington Post saying this, UN protected safe area, this town of Srebrenica, which the UN had promised would be defended, had fallen. There was, no effort to stop the Serb attack. There were several days when actions could have been taken. There was one very small airstrike. Nothing happens. The Serbs overrun the town, and you have 30,000 Muslims who have been surrounded in this encircled town. The men set off to try to walk through the woods, to walk through Serb-controlled territory to make it to another part of Bosnia that's also controlled by the Bosnian Muslims. The women all go to the UN base in town, which has Dutch UN peacekeepers. No one kind of knows what happens next. The women are loaded onto buses and driven to a part of Bosnia controlled by Bosnian Muslims. And eventually men start kind of straggling out of the woods. There are some men who make it through this long, I want to say 15 or 20 mile hike through the woods to make it to safety. But they say that the Serbs are rounding up every Bosnian Muslim man they can catch in the woods and shooting them. And no one has any way to prove this. There are the satellite pictures you mentioned. And, several weeks later, this is now like late August. It's, 6 weeks after the fall of the town. I'm driving through that part of Bosnia. I'm allowed more freedom than I expect to drive around. And I end up getting a copy of the satellite photo, going to a little village called Novokosova, and finding these mass graves. They were very close to a soccer field. And there was some freshly turned earth and some digging that had gone on there. Clearly there was an empty ammunition box. There were these papers I picked up. They turned out to be high school diplomas and other personal papers from Bosnian Muslims. And then I remember approaching this one spot of freshly turned earth, and there was something white. And when I got closer, that actually was a human femur sticking out of the ground.
That phrase, freshly turned earth, is so memorable. And I remember it from when you were there. I was in the safety of the ABC News headquarters. I was writing for Peter Jennings at the time. And I just remember from a distance hearing that phrase, because again, from the satellite, they saw that stadium where the Bosnian civilians were held. I guess they had a satellite photo of a full stadium before shot, full stadium, a stadium full of people, no freshly turned earth. And then the after shot some days later, no people in the stadium and several mounds of freshly turned earth that looked like mass graves. But it wasn't until you got there and picked up that femur and other evidence that civilians were buried there that we didn't know for sure.
Yeah, and I was stunned. I left quickly. I didn't touch the remains, and I left very quickly. And I ended up doing subsequent stories. Went back in a second time, made it to another mass grave. This one was near a school and some railroad tracks. Everything again was exactly as survivors had described, and then went to yet another mass grave. This was all on the same day at an earthen dam. And when I was at that grave, I was looking around. I couldn't really find anything, and then I did see some bones. And there was a watchman at the earthen dam who saw me, and he approached me and arrested me. And I ended up spending 10 days in captivity with the Bosnian Serbs. They said, "You're a spy, you're not a journalist," and, made threats, but I was well treated. And then a lot of people were pushing my family, my newspaper, the Christian Science Monitor, and Richard Holbrooke was able to pressure the Bosnian Serbs into releasing me. I was very lucky.
And then I just want to read, I was looking at some of your reporting, and you were working for the Christian Science Monitor at the time. And I'm just going to read you the opening graph of one of those pieces that was recognized for the Pulitzer, I believe. From 100 yards away, here's that phrase again, the freshly turned earth of the field appeared to be covered with haphazard dots. 5 feet away, the dots became empty shoes, shattered eyeglasses, and decaying clothing. That difference, and the reason I'm sort of harping on this, is that you are one of these journalists who was not satisfied to be 100 yards away. You went right up 5 feet away at great risk to yourself. And I'm just curious where you got that impulse, where you got that drive to get 5 feet away.
Well, I think we all, have that impulse to get to be as thorough as you can, and I was at that point. I'd gone in and made the first trip, and I was generally shocked by the femur. I'd interviewed a bunch of survivors, and I was it was unclear if there was ever going to be a peace in Bosnia at that point. The peace talks had started. So I just was determined. I'd met these survivors. They described the school. They described the railroad tracks. And I guess I was determined to prove whether these survivors were telling the truth or not. And it was horrible to see those shoes. And, you're just bringing back memories. And it's in the story, but nearby there was a bunch of clothes in the woods nearby. It was like a pile of jackets and stuff like that. And there were canes among them. So that to me meant some of the execution victims were old men.
And so one of the things Samantha Power says, and actually it's one of the main themes in her book on genocide, A Problem from Hell, she recalls being a reporter in Bosnia around that same time, reporting on the Playground Massacre, which happened a short time before that. And then being surprised that the Serb forces would go as far as they did in Srebrenica. And one of the repeated observations she has on genocides throughout the 20th century is that it was a failure of imagination on the part of policymakers, civilians, journalists, a failure to imagine just how evil people could be. And she sort of berates herself a little bit for not being able to imagine what would have happened in Srebrenica based on her own experience with the playground massacre. She should have been able to imagine it in her mind. What has this whole experience done for your imagination? And I almost think is there a link between that and, now you're not putting your life at risk, presumably with your exploration of the is there a deep state? But somehow to me that it's the role of imagination in all this is really critical.
I'm sort of rolling up my sleeves here metaphorically and literally. Look, the quick and honest summary is that time in Bosnian Serb captivity, the Serbs were convinced. They said, "Oh, you're a NATO spy. You were at that dam, not to look for a grave. You were going to have NATO jets target that dam, and they'd wipe out the villages nearby." And then later on, I was held captive by the Taliban many years later. They had, their own kind of conspiracy theories. They felt 9/11 was staged to create a pretext for, U.S. troops to invade Muslim countries. And they believed that U.S. troops in Afghanistan were forcibly converting Muslims to Christianity. They believed Afghan women were being forced to work as prostitutes. So all, the combined experiences, my sort of view of human nature is that, yes, there are definitely people who steal or abuse others, and maybe they enjoy it. They're conscious of what they're doing. But what struck me is that the kind of biggest, I feel, danger for humans is our ability to rationalize our behavior. So in both cases, the Serbs are Orthodox Christians, and they believed they were defending, Europe from a invasion by, Muslims. In fact, Bosnian Muslims had lived in Bosnia or have for centuries. And, I wasn't, they told me I was getting paid by OPEC to write stories about mass killings around Srebrenica. And then the flip side of that was, what the Taliban believed. So, when we feel we're protecting, our nation, our faith, our culture, our family, our way of life, humans have an ability to rationalize, the need to stretch the truth, and in this, very extreme cases, use violence.
To stretch the truth.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Just one. Yeah. So this whole idea, and you say the Afghans. So now we're fast forwarding a little bit to what was it? 13 years later, you in Afghanistan, 2009, 2008, 2009.
Yep.
And you're hearing these conspiracy theories, and the Afghans who are conveying this to you, they're not just saying this as a pretext for whatever they're doing. They truly believe this, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, no question. Particularly the younger Taliban, the guards who were guarding us.
And so it's fascinating to me, and again, just to foreshadow that we will be getting to your current book, which is about a conspiracy theory, or at least your inquiry into it, left open the possibility that maybe it's not a conspiracy. Maybe there's something to it. And it was a very open-minded, open-ended inquiry. But just pausing in Afghanistan in 2008, 2009, I would love for you, if you don't mind reliving it, but you wrote
It's totally fine.
Okay, and you wrote a book,
yeah,
A Rope and a Prayer, and I highly recommend it to anyone because it's beautifully done. It's you and your wife, your new wife at the time,
yep,
telling the story in alternating chapters from your perspective in Afghanistan and her perspective in New York, trying to figure out how to not endanger you, first of all, and how to get you out of there. And I urge everyone to read the book, but I want you to take us to that day, that night, that you and one of your fellow captives decided this is the night that we are going to escape, after you tell us how many months you had been in captivity at that point.
It was 7 months. I remember that this was a headline on the New York Times, so I wrote about it. So it was 7 months and 10 days in captivity. it was me and two Afghans who worked with journalists. One was Tahir Ludin. He was an Afghan reporter, and Assad Mangal was a driver. And basically, we've been lied to for 7 months straight. We've been told, oh, there's a deal and you're going to be released. And then we were never released. And we were moved to all these different houses. And folks talk about like Stockholm Syndrome. And after a while, you feel sympathy or understand your captor's viewpoint. I didn't experience that at all. I had come to interview this Taliban commander. He had done interviews with a couple of European journalists. I talked to a French journalist who'd interviewed him, and she said, you might be in more danger as an American, but you should be, okay. And the minute we arrived for the interview, they abducted us. So I hated them.
But by the way, that's one of those risks that journalists are always taking. And again, I've never risked it on the front line, but I remember being at CNN and editing some of the pieces from our people in the field. And there would always be these calculations, do I stay out in the field a little past sunset because I'm in the middle of getting some great material, or do I get out of there sooner? You must look back on that and obviously realize you pushed it a little too far, but it's not your fault that you were taken captive. How did that assessment go for you at the time?
I regret that decision, and I actually compare it to Srebrenica. So in that, going into Serb territory twice to find mass graves was worth it. Because what you want to do, and I say this to young journalists, you think through the importance of the story you're possibly going to get. This is actually something that was come up by a French journalist named Didier Francois. He was held captive by ISIS. He was held captive with James Foley and Stephen Sotloff, the two American journalists who were murdered by ISIS. Didier Francois was ransomed indirectly by the French government and survived. The Americans were killed. The United States government, back to more conspiracies, but the United States government does not pay ransom for hostages. That is the policy, and that's the truth. But Didier sort of came with a system where you should think through, on a 5-point scale, as if you have a story as a young, telling this to younger journalists, 1 through 5, like what is the impact of the story? Is it, if you go to this village and go down that road, is it, what kind of, impact will the story make, in terms of the world and getting this information? And then 1 through 5, what's the risk? And you kind of come up with a score, and based on your fingers, make that decision. So in hindsight, going into Srebrenica and proving that 7,000, the final number is, between 7,000 and 8,000 men and boys had been executed, was worth risking my life. It was an incredibly important thing to prove. There was no agreement. The war wasn't over. I'd heard from sources that the Serbs were digging up graves and moving the bodies and hiding them. So I don't regret that decision. Going to interview a Taliban commander who I wanted to be a character in my book. I wanted to write the best book possible. I'd been covering Afghanistan at that point for about 6.5 years, and I've been very careful because I had the earlier kidnapping or detention in Bosnia, and I didn't want that to happen again. And then I let competition get the best of me in Afghanistan. Another reporter from the Times had interviewed the Taliban recently. There was a cover story on Rolling Stone, and I kind of blew it, and I regret going to interview the Taliban commander. This is a longer answer, but it's a tough decision, where you're what's an appropriate risk. I can just say that Tahir, the Afghan journalist, and I, sat around in captivity for 7 months, thinking we were being sort of forced to, pay penance by God for our sins. And, for me, it was ambition. And Tahir sort of felt the same way. And we've just felt terrible for our families. And I'll now get to why he and I escaped. Because it was, it's a weird thing, a kidnapping. And let me first say, everyone says, oh, kidnapping, and it's so terrifying. It became very quickly clear to us that they were keeping us and they wanted ransom, and they saw us as, hugely valuable. They were, crazy. They wanted $25 million for me, and I can't remember 8 or 10 prisoners from Guantanamo. Neither was possible. My family and the New York Times didn't have that kind of money or access to prisoners. So Tahir and I were just more and more frustrated, more and more angry at them.
Well, I'm sorry. What was the name of the gentleman again who was with you? Tahir.
We were more and more frustrated, and anyway, we've been there for several months. Tahir is being taken outside because he's an Afghan and he mixes in the local community. He's taken outside when they go shopping for groceries and do other things. So we're moved to a new house in this town and now in the sort of mountains, the tribal areas of Pakistan where U.S. forces aren't present. There are just U.S. drones flying overhead. And Tahir said this new house we're in is the closest we've ever been to this Pakistani military base that was nearby where we were being held. And he said if we're going to try to escape, it should be from here. I think even before that, I was rummaging around this house and had found this car tow rope along with a bunch of wrenches and motor oil and stuff like that.
I want to pause you. I wanted to, so I'm clear.
Yeah.
That was a car tow rope.
Yeah. I had been rummaging around in the house and found on this shelf a car tow rope, and along with motor oil and wrenches and stuff like that, and had hidden the rope. And essentially, we decided that we were going to try to escape that night, and if people who are following me closely will notice, it's me and Tahir, the journalist. Assad Mangal was our driver. He knew that if they were going to start killing us, the Taliban would kill him first as the driver. In a previous kidnapping with an Italian journalist, the Taliban had killed the driver in that case as a way to increase pressure on the Italian government and the Italian journalist's family. So at that point, after 7 months, Assad, our driver, was essentially cooperating with our guards. We talked to Assad about escaping earlier, and he told the guards. So Tahir and I got up that night, grabbed the rope. The guards were asleep, tied it to a wall, and then lowered ourselves off this roof down into an alleyway. And Tahir knew how to guide us. And he, brought us to the exterior of the Pakistani military base. The guards there didn't know who we were. They loaded their rifles and started screaming at us. And, we froze, and we ended up sort of taking our shirts off to show we weren't suicide bombers. I had a long beard at that point. And finally, I can't remember, 15, 20 minutes. It was a very long period. They let us on that base.
I'm just going to read this one sentence. Tahir had asked the guards, the Pakistani guards who you had put yourself before at their mercy at the base, to protect us under the tenet of Pashtunwali that, you want to finish that? It's an obligation that Pashtunwalis have.
Yeah, it's an obligation that Pashtuns have, that anyone who requests protection, you have to take them into your home and shelter them. And so my life was...
I'm sorry, if I can add, it says, even at the cost of the host's fortune and life, you wrote.
Yeah. And that's why I escaped, and I'm alive because the Afghan journalist who was kidnapped with me didn't betray me, waited with me, guided me that night, and then spoke, Pashto to these guards, these Pakistani military guards, and requested that they protect us under a custom I, barely understood. So it wasn't my bravery; it was the bravery of, Tahir Ludin, who I'm happy to say lives in the United States, is a U.S. citizen. His family members are coming to the United States slowly through the U.S. immigration system. And then Assad, our driver, he was released actually several weeks after we escaped. And he's also now here living in the United States. So it's a miracle that all three of us survived. And I'm, deeply grateful and apologetic to both of them. Again, my ambitions, my glorious book led these two Afghans to be kidnapped and nearly killed.
And just one last note on this calculation that the Pashtuns make, that even if it is a risk to my own fortune and life, I will protect you, that you are in my territory and I will protect you. When they do that scale of 1 to 5, risk and reward, that's such a powerful idea, that you are willing to risk it all, not for some grand, impact on the world, but for one person.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. And that's why I'm here today.
So, you said something that's actually a pretty good transition to your current book, In Deep, the FBI, the CIA, and the Truth About America's Deep State. You said when you were a hostage, everyone knew the United States, America does not pay for hostages. A major part of the early part of your book is a U.S. effort, though, to sort of pay for the release of hostages, which is, if I'm correct, the Iran-Contra.
Correct, yes.
And so I'm fascinated. To me, deep state or not, whatever the title of this book was, I was grateful for the essential history lesson you gave us, a history that many of us sort of lived through. You start in the late 1970s with the Church Commission, which I remember studying in college as very, very recent history, but I forgot what an impact that had on the political culture of America. So if you don't mind just starting with that and orienting us, because it's so relevant to helping us evaluate what's going on today.
So it's the late 70s. Watergate has already happened, and journalists are breaking stories about illegal activities by the CIA and the FBI that have been going on for decades during the Cold War. And there is a Senate committee is appointed, chaired by Frank Church, a senator from Idaho. John Tower, a Texas Republican, is the minority ranking member, and they do an exhaustive investigation of the abuses that went on during the Cold War by the FBI and the CIA. The results are astounding. The CIA was conducting surveillance on Americans inside the United States. CIA had followed John Lennon when he was protesting the Vietnam War. The FBI, it's well known now, but it had been, wiretapping and trying to smear and derail civil rights organizations, Martin Luther King in particular. J. Edgar Hoover had a list of 18,000 Americans that he wanted to round up in case of emergency. That included Norman Mailer. They were considered subversives. And one of the best parts of the book was actually interviewing the chief investigator for the committee. His name is Fritz Schwartz, and his middle initials are A.O. So his name is F.A.O. Schwartz. He is a member of the very wealthy family that ran the famous New York City toy store. He's a WASP. He went to Harvard. And he told me that, as he did this investigation, as he interviewed FBI and CIA officials, he expected to like and kind of identify with the CIA officials more, because at that point, the CIA was a blue blood organization. It was WASPs and Ivy Leaguers like him. And he said that he found interviewing the CIA officials blood chilling. They were unbelievably skilled liars, and he had an incredibly difficult time sensing when they were lying and when they weren't. And it kind of really shook him that he was unable to have a better sense of when someone was deceiving him. And then he met the FBI officials. He considered the FBI officials more of a direct threat to American democracy, because these FBI officials were interfering in constitutionally protected activities. These were legitimate political activities. Students for a democratic society protesting the Vietnam War. They were breaking into people's houses without any kind of search warrants, black bag jobs, they were famously called. And what the FBI agent said was they, back to our theme, rationalized their actions. The FBI agents felt that the United States was under threat. It was being infiltrated by foreigners, foreign ideologies, communism. They felt that the Vietnam War protesters were being funded by foreign countries, by the Soviet Union or China or Vietnam, to create division and dissension in the United States. So they felt they had to take matters into their own hands and not get search warrants. Write fake letters designed to confuse these groups. I mean, it was a dirty tricks campaign they carried out. So it's a tremendous report. It creates a narrative, we'll come back to this, but a sort of history of the abuses carried out by these agencies that in the end most Americans accepted. Sure, there were some that, some CIA officials who hated the church committee, but it's a theme I'll talk about, but there was a common kind of basic set of facts about what had gone wrong and a need to stop it. President Ford embraces it, President Carter does. Massive reforms, new committees are created in Congress, intelligence committees in the House and Senate. They have subpoena powers. They can subpoena anybody they want from the CIA and FBI. Special counsels are created to investigate presidents. This is a post-Watergate reform. A new surveillance court, a federal court is created, the FISA court, to make the FBI get a judge's approval before they surveil any Americans. And inspectors general are created as a way, again, to investigate abuse and corruption. But the idea is that you have all branches of government overseeing the CIA and the FBI. One other specific thing, Ford, bans assassinations by the CIA abroad. Ford and Carter both banned the CIA from operating in the United States. And again, the super secret CIA, in the past, when they did a covert operation overseas, there were sort of verbal conversations between a CIA director and a president. Now they mandated by law that there had to be written covert action findings signed by the president, copies of which were given to the ranking members of both parties in Congress, both parties and the ranking members and the vice members of each intelligence committee in the House and the Senate. And this created a kind of rules of the road that many people in the CIA and the FBI kind of resented all this oversight and intrusion, but they came to sort of welcome it because it was a system where they could conduct espionage and conduct criminal investigations and kind of know what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. Their fear was that they would be asked to do certain things by one president, and then a new president would come in and they might be, held accountable for it or prosecuted for it.
As I'm listening to you say that, it's this idea of regulations that are ultimately welcomed by the people being regulated. It often plays out in the economy where companies just want the predictability. And as you say, they want to know the rules of the road.
Yeah. And I know there's a huge number of people who are, watching or listening to this who will kind of scoff at the idea that FBI agents and CIA operatives want rules of the road, but, they did. This became a big issue after 9/11. And what changes, though, the system is not perfect, all kinds of abuses, there's no question. But since these reforms were enacted, the church reforms, there were, behaviors that were wrong or criticized, such as, the waterboarding and torture that went on of detainees after 9/11. Warrantless mass surveillance. There was a surveillance program where the Bush administration did not go to that federal court and ask for permission. They just started surveilling folks. But that's examples of the CIA, and the NSA and the FBI doing things that the president asked them to do. The problem of a rogue FBI and CIA that was kind of out of control, that the president couldn't control and the congressional committees couldn't control, and even sort of judges. If, let's say it's an improper search, the judge can throw out the evidence the FBI has. That is abated. I don't know if it's gone, but I think there has not been a major scandal where until the Trump-Russia investigation. I do think, largely speaking, the system worked and has worked, through several decades. It's now under tremendous strain, though.
And so it's now under tremendous. It's interesting because within your answer were some of the terms that have come to be part of our daily lives. FISA courts, special counsels or independent counsels.
Inspectors general, in terms of the fight over an inspector general to oversee the $2 trillion that have been approved for the coronavirus. And
so when these were all instituted, you're finding that there was truly, if not unanimous, they were instituted with bipartisan support.
Yes, but there was a strain of people, and this, we're now getting into Bill Barr, who's the current Attorney General and one of the central characters of the book. There's a feeling, and actually Gerald Ford, welcomes this initially, but by later in his presidency, he decides that Congress has created too much oversight of the executive branch, and that the presidency has lost too much power in the wake of Watergate. The reforms have sort of gone too far. And he's agreed in this by a young legal scholar at that point named Antonin Scalia, who would go on to become a famous Supreme Court justice. He's also supported by two senior staffers in the White House, the Ford White House. That would be Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. Bill Barr learns about, he's much younger, but he learns about this also. And I'll just quickly, Barr gave a speech about all this. It's a clear philosophy he's had his entire career. That the presidency needs to be powerful, that and the powers it lost during Watergate, should be restored. That inspectors general are an infringement on the president's right to run the executive branch. So is an inspector general. And in a speech at the Federalist Society last fall, Barr talked about why he believed this, and he said that the presidency is the most effective branch when the country's facing a crisis. That if you have a pandemic, you have a 9/11, you need a chief executive who can act decisively, marshal resources, and save the country. And he said, essentially Congress and the judiciary can't do it, or had failed past attempts. There's other people, other constitutional scholars who just reject that. They say it's an excessive interpretation of the powers the president has. And then the concern is that you're consolidating almost too much power. So one of the questions of the book, the In Deep book, is how powerful should a president be?
And so the Barr material is fascinating. It seemed like every other chapter, there he is again. And you know what? All those people who said, boy, we can't understand why he is promoting certain ideas that he is now. If your book had come out a couple of years ago, they probably would have understood it.
And I want to be fair to him. I mean, he's believed this his whole life. I talked to his, high school classmates, and he argued this in American history class, at Horace Mann High School in New York City. So it's not because of Donald Trump he's doing this, but, other, scholars, Stephen Gillers, an NYU law professor, says this is an incredibly dangerous combination. Bill Barr believing you need an incredibly powerful president, and then Donald Trump, who, and I say this in the book, and I want to, be fair, whether it's out of fear or calculation, Trump feels that the career government servants around him are leaking about him, undermining him, refusing to carry out his wishes, and he wants power. He feels he deserves it. And so it's sort of an extraordinary combination of things right now in our country.
And so it almost, to understand it fully, and then I want you to tie the pieces together if we could. You do give a very important, again, what's the root of the term deep state? And I know you've spoken about it, but it really does help us to just anchor what this word means. And then I want to get back to the conspiracy theory before we leave.
Sure. So, the term deep state was first used, as far as I could tell, about Turkey and the Turkish military and their efforts to slow down or slow the emergence of democracy in Turkey. It was applied sometimes to Egypt as well, in the Egyptian military and intelligence service. And it really wasn't used in a widespread way in the United States for many years. The first example I found was a book by a University of California at Berkeley professor named Peter Dale Scott. He wrote it in 2007. I found him, Professor Scott, and he said in his mind, the deep state, and it's the first in his book, he applies it to the American government. And he's talking more about the military-industrial complex. And this is kind of the liberals' view of a deep state. And this would be a cabal of generals and defense contractors that leads the country into endless wars. And his worry also and this is a little different, is Wall Street as well. Financial interests that want to control the country and where we're headed. He goes on InfoWars, Alex Jones's show, and he told me that years later now he kind of regrets that. He feels that the term deep state has sort of been thrown around and used in a lot of different ways. It's been vulgarized, was the term he used. Fast forwarding to 2016, there's an essay in Breitbart magazine after Trump has won the election. It's an anonymous story written by someone using the pen name Virgil, but it says that a great struggle has begun between the president-elect Donald Trump and the deep state. And the conservatives talk about it more. I think the better term is the administrative state. And this is a fear of a kind of ever-growing government that's relentlessly invading our lives and taking away our rights and sort of telling us what to do. And, there's a very early sense in the Trump administration that they are, in this struggle. And then Bannon, who was running Breitbart at the time, says that one of the goals that he has of the Trump administration, according to Steve Bannon, is the destruction of the administrative state.
So as I'm listening to you, it really strikes me the going back to your uncovering of the mass graves, and you had your risk reward analysis, and you're not going to stay 100 yards away. You're going to go 5 feet. I think you mentioned in the book how this deep state idea is a little amorphous. And so how do you even get to within 5 feet of being able to prove or disprove that there is a deep state?
I talked to, and some people didn't talk to me. Bannon, didn't talk to me. I didn't talk to President Trump. Bill Barr didn't talk to me. I talked to many of his friends and people who've worked with him over the years. I talked to a lot of current and former officials in the Trump administration, in the Obama administration, in the Bush administration. And I just said, do you think there's a deep state? And look, every president comes into Washington and can get frustrated with the bureaucracy. And they're right. They win an election. They have a mandate from voters to carry out certain policies. That's the core of our democracy. And they're right that government servants should carry out the orders of the president or a senator, or a member of the House, or laws, because they have the mandate of the people, and they are the power. And that is correct, as long as their orders are legal. So look, when Ronald Reagan came into Washington, he was frustrated with the State Department. He felt that it was lean left and it wouldn't carry out his anti-communist agenda. Barack Obama was frustrated with the Pentagon. He felt that generals were releasing troop numbers for a possible surge in Afghanistan and kind of backing him into a corner to send more troops they wanted. But no president, has said what Donald Trump has said, which is that there is an active coup being carried out against him. Has called the FBI agents who investigated his campaign human scum. And this has grown. The term deep state has, been used. It's spread. It was first the FBI and then the CIA. And then there was a special forces soldier that was being tried, and Trump defended him. And certain military officials said, no, he should be subject to the Uniform Military Code of Justice. And Trump then said the Pentagon was part of the deep state. And now you have, some Trump supporters, not the president himself, calling Tony Fauci, the country's top infectious disease expert, a member of the deep state. And so all these members of the administration said they never saw, an organized, politically motivated effort by bureaucrats to undermine or oust the president. Did government, career people fight over turf? Did they try to increase their budget's deficit? Did they leak stories, that would help, them and their agency in a policy fight? Absolutely. But, even current members of the Trump administration told me they agreed that the talk of a coup was exaggerated.
So it's interesting because you start with that, that in many ways, this idealistic church committee which says, we're outraged. We're
Yeah.
outraged at what we've learned, we've gone on.
Yeah.
We, as a people, as a nation, really are in trouble with this inability to be, or this reduced ability to be shocked and to be so cynical. And what is the antidote to the cynicism? So I ask you, thinking about the whole trajectory of your reporting career, it doesn't feel like the cynicism has impacted you. I mean, for you to be able to say, I'm going to take a deep dive into this concept of the deep state and really have an open mind about it. But you tell me, when you hear this, the lack of shock, the cynicism, how does that figure into your view of the world?
I think it's dangerous. I think that the kind of increase in conspiracy theories is really concerning to me. And I think part of it, and this is, I credit you as an interviewer, there is a link from the earlier work in my career to today. This is not, Bosnia during the war. This is not Afghanistan. And I totally want to be fair to President Trump. He hasn't arrested any journalists. There aren't detention camps here. He's said, terrible things about journalists, but, I'm not, so I don't want to exaggerate what's happening. But I was motivated to write this book because I've seen how people rationalize, what they're doing. They feel they're defending their faith and their family and their way of life. And I see hints of that here. I saw how propaganda was used in Bosnia. I saw how it was used with my Taliban guard. So it's a very dangerous thing. I think we're far away from there. I found, many of these civil servants inspiring. There's a character in the book named Tom O'Connor. He's an FBI agent. He was a policeman in Northampton, Massachusetts. And he joins the FBI. It's the late 90s. He's sent over to investigate the bombing of the USS Cole. His job is basically the crime scene, and he recovers the remains of folks. He recovers the sailors who died in the Cole. He drives to the Pentagon on the, after 9/11 attacks happened. He spends weeks there, and he and other FBI agents collect more than 2,000 bags of human remains. He's sent to Iraq, and he investigates the shooting by Blackwater security guards of Iraqi civilians in a traffic circle in Tahrir Square. He then comes back to the U.S. and he investigates racially motivated, violent extremist groups. He retired this year on 9/11. He was outraged at the government. He was one of these many first responders. If you remember this hearing where Jon Stewart spoke with total disdain towards Congress about the inability, the failure to fund these cancer treatment and help these first responders who've gotten cancer after 9/11. Tom O'Connor is a couple rows behind him. And I asked Tom as he retired, it's a mess. And the broad feeling from him and the FBI and the CIA agents I talked to, it wasn't like, look, both organizations are just divided like the rest of the country. There's folks who like, the president and folks who don't like it. But I said to O'Connor, what are you going to do in retirement? Would you ever want to run for office and maybe, kind of clean up this mess? And Tom O'Connor said, no way. I want to do something that has meaning. That's a terrible, terrible sign for our democracy. There was kind of an alienation, a kind of disgust among, and again, people hate FBI agents, they hate CIA operatives, but I'm worried about all across the government. They're not angels. None of us are angels. There's bad journalists, in any profession you got bad eggs. But, the people feeling they don't want to work for the government anymore because they are kind of scorched earth, no holds barred, score every point you can politics. And in the media also, is just alienating people, turning them off. They don't believe in our democracy. And so I meet people like that, and it, makes me think that, there's a chance that we'll enact new reforms and find common ground and come out of this. But it alarms me. And I did not find a deep state. There are very powerful, organizations that need to be monitored aggressively. by all the different branches of government and by the press. But this talk of conspiracy theory is dangerous and feeds on itself, and it needs to slow down.
So you've got two kids. So when we get off the line here, you're at your in-laws' house. And by the way, I never tied up that knot. I ask people to read a rope and a prayer because they will find out what happened when your mother-in-law got that call from Afghanistan.
My mother-in-law is the hero too. She's helped save our lives.
She got that call from you with a lot of instructions after you had escaped, but we're still not completely out of the woods yet. Right. So read a rope and a prayer. But as parents, you probably struggle with this. I have 3 kids, two of them are completely grown and out of the home. And our oldest is an artist and was always very sensitive. And in 4th grade, she was in her art class and the teacher put newspaper over the art table to prevent paint from getting on the table, and hadn't really read what newspaper she was putting down. And in the corner, there was a little story about a massacre in Finland of some high school kids. And I remembered very clearly, and our daughter saw that little blurb and came home very disturbed for a number of days. And after ruminating about this, asked me, "Dad, if the world were a movie, what would it be rated?" What would you tell my daughter Lee, and what would you tell your kids if they came up to you and asked that question?
That's a pretty lame answer. I want to say PG-13. Like I
all want to say that.
My children are humans at their best. They haven't been filled with all this kind of fear and division and anxiety. I would say part of being able to write this book was kind of the amazing support of my wife, who, as we know, I put through a lot over the years. I stopped. By the way, as soon as I got back from the kidnapping in Afghanistan, I stopped all war reporting. I have not been back to Afghanistan and Pakistan in a decade. I changed my career. I had put my wife and family and editors and friends through enough. And that was part of this book, was to kind of do reporting in Washington and move in a different direction. But, my daughters, I want them to inherit, this great country. We're struggling now, but there are these ideals, this ideals of of transparency, of the rule of law, of equal justice under law, of democracy. And it's an extraordinary system. And this current time is an amazing civics lesson, for the country about these different branches. And as I wrote the book, I realized that's, what I was seeing. So yeah, there's a lot of awful adult stuff, PG-13, but with proper guidance. I guess I want that. I want to see our better angels. I've definitely seen our darker angels. And I think we can get through this. And if you go back to the church reforms and the trauma of that time, even post 9/11, things go wrong, there's excesses. We have reformed as a country. We fight like hell. It takes too long. Not everything's made right, but I want them to fight for those ideals. And so if everything is terrible and dark, there's nothing to fight for. But there are vital things to fight for in this country.
Well, David Rohde, thank you for allowing us into your in-laws' home
Sure.
and joining us on. We hope you can get to Nantucket in the flesh at some point soon, but joining us on At Home with Authors.
Thank you, Michael, so much. And this was an incredibly incisive interview, and the fact that you took the time to look at my work over so many years is really touching, and I'm honored and surprised and just grateful to you. So I'd love to meet in person and talk to you and many, many other folks.
I would. That would be fantastic. Thanks so much.
Thank you for all your journalism as well.
Yeah, appreciate it very much. Thanks so much, David.
Take care.